Hello, and welcome to Archives and Records Simplified. These videos are aimed at people looking for basic knowledge about archives and records management, although at times I will also touch slightly on information and library science. These videos are designed to provide bite-sized chunks, which means that almost every video will be less than 15 minutes. These videos are honestly for everyone, and comments and suggestions are always more than welcome. About me, Sean McMillan, I'm an archivist based in London, and you can learn more about me via my LinkedIn profile, to which there is a link posted below. And I'll also post a transcript and notes also if you struggle at any point to understand my accent. And lastly, if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could kindly like, subscribe and share. Thanks again. Okay, so this video is about maintaining accuracy on a cataloguing project. Okay, so first of all, why does accuracy matter in a cataloguing project? So the first thing I would say is that cataloguing a collection can easily result in the creation of hundreds or even thousands of descriptions. And for every description you create, there's also additional materials as part of that description. So for example, every description you create should have at the very least a title and a reference number, but it's often helpful to also record details such as date, language, extent, and any access conditions. So for example, if you create 500 descriptions as part of a catalogue, then you've also got 500 titles, you've got 500 extents, you've got 500 reference codes. You follow the idea. And catalogues often rely very heavily on consistency, and this means that you want to be consistent across the catalogue. So for example, if you're describing the extent of materials, you would want to make sure that you're being consistent across. So for example, you wouldn't describe one part of the collection in meters or centimeters and another part of the collection in inches. Do you understand what I'm saying? This also is true for dates. For example, if you follow a very specific format of expressing dates at one part of the collection, you generally want to be consistent here rather than expressing it a different way in other parts of the collection. So that's consistency is a major point, and that's something that you should often always be thinking about when you're cataloguing a collection. Also, according to, if you want your collection to be shared widely and to be accessed, then it's really important that you try comply with standards as far as possible, especially standards such as ISAG, and sometimes these standards will have very specific ways about how you should describe and express information. So for example, according to ISAG, it's important that descriptions go from the general to the specific, and that higher descriptions in a hierarchy should be inclusive of the details below. So for example, if a subseries includes a file that is dated from 1947 to 1950, then the subseries must also be inclusive of this. So for example, the subseries couldn't be dated from 1946 to 1949, as it would not include the details below. I use that example because that's a small example of mistakes that I've seen come up in a lot of catalogues. And that would be an example of something that you would want to keep an eye on. And that would be an example of where poor attention to detail or poor accuracy would really hinder the quality of a cataloguing project. Okay, so in terms of practical advice, I would say the first thing I would say is to plan a schedule and also plan for quality controls. And if you plan a schedule that includes quality controls, then you'll find that you perform a lot better. This might be done daily, weekly, or monthly, but it's also important to note that as the scale increases, so does the complexity. So if you're cataloguing a much larger collection with potentially thousands of descriptions, then the scale of the quality control also has to increase. And I would say it often helps to focus on one task at a time to reduce mistakes. And what I really mean by this is breaking the project down into carefully planned steps with a workflow. So for example, you might update the reference code as one specific project and also do the sensitivity review where you note the access and restrictions conditions as another. And it's also, I think, something to keep in mind is that some details are also more important than others. So for example, the reference code and the title are actually quite vital. Those are two pieces of information that you really need to record accurately, more so than others. So when you're planning workflows and quality controls, these are maybe the first things I would look at, and then I'd maybe look at the less important stuff second. When it comes to quality controlling and reviewing your work, I think having a template of best practice to compare to can be really, really helpful. Sometimes when I'm working on a cataloguing project, especially if I'm working for an institution that has their own guidelines or style guides, what I'll do is I'll maybe catalogue, say, the first box or so as an example, and then I'll send it to my line manager, I'll send it to someone in the university to look over, and if they approve it or they note it, then I'll keep that example to go back to for future cataloguing, so that I can double check that my style is compliant with what is expected of me. And that actually brings me on to another point. I would say that seek feedback where possible, and also be open to feedback. If you work for a smaller institutions, this might be less necessary, less possible, but with larger organizations, if you do have the opportunity for someone to take a look at your catalog, even if it's not someone that's an archivist, even if it's just someone from another profession that's capable of just proofreading a bit, that's something I would always recommend. Sometimes for really large catalogs, it's really not feasible to expect someone to read all of it, but if they could, for example, just look at the collection level description, then that can be really helpful. And I would also say that good documentation and admin skills are also massively underrated. So for example, when you're box listing a collection, especially if you're using Excel, it can be it can be very easy to create multiple copies of the same document. I tend to undertake little small checks. So for example, if I'm creating a box list, what I'll do is I'll date that box list as the date I last updated it, and I'll maybe be careful not to create unnecessary duplicates. So that's just a small bit of advice that I think can make a big difference over the long term. Okay, so another piece of advice, and I really can't emphasize this as much as possible, is that try use technology as much as possible. And I would say this is highly recommended for large and complex collections with multiple descriptions. So for example, many content management softwares will include inbuilt features that will prevent you from making mistakes. So just to give you an example of a content management software, Calm Axial or AdLib would be an example of a content management software. And these softwares will say, for example, have features whereby if you forget to add in a reference code or a title, the software will notify you of this mistake. Another thing that the software might do is if you create a duplicate reference code, which you shouldn't really do in a cataloging project, the software will inform you of this as well. So if you're using a content management software, it can be really helpful to be aware of those functions and have those features as a safety net. Another benefit I would say of some content management softwares, depending on which ones you're using, is that they also offer you the possibility to copy records. So for example, if you're cataloging a collection where many of the details and the descriptions are the same, such as the language details, or even many records have the same title, or that they have the same extent, so it's like a series of books or a series of one files, then copying can be a really easy way to reduce errors because it means that you only have to update a smaller amount of details each time. So for each new record, you're not having to create a new title, a new description, a new extent, etc. You're not having to do everything from scratch. So copying and pasting in some can be a very useful feature to have. If possible, I also think it can be worthwhile exporting your catalogue into Microsoft Word and running a spell check. Sometimes the spell checker in Microsoft Word can be a lot more powerful than you'll get in some content management softwares. And of course, some content management softwares won't spell check at all. The great thing about Microsoft Word is I think there's other features where you can sort of ignore all. So for example, if something's coming up quite a lot as a spelling mistake because it's just generally spelt that way, such as an unusual sounding place name, then you can ask Microsoft Word to ignore that. So sometimes when I'm checking a lot of descriptions, what I'll do is I'll copy and paste it into Microsoft Word and I'll see if any errors come up. Also, what some people do, depending on their workflows and their systems, is that they might prepare a catalogue on Microsoft Excel first. Often, if they've box listed it in Microsoft Excel before they copy it onto a cataloging software. I've did this myself. I catalogued a collection once using Archivist Toolkit, which I found could be a bit awkward at times. And often, what I'd do is I would arrange the collection in Excel first, and then I would copy it onto Archivist Toolkit. Then another advantage of that is that you back up your collection into different formats. If you do that, it can be really helpful to know what functions Excel offer and how you can use them to best advantage. So for example, one of the best features of Excel, in my opinion, is the sort function, and this can be really useful if you're checking for any mistakes. So say for example, I had an Excel sheet where I had maybe 300 descriptions and for each description I want to check sure that I've got the correct date. By sorting them, often what you'll tend to find is that any mistakes will go to the bottom or the top of the list. So for example, if most of the dates are between 1970 and 1960, and you have a date where you've accidentally added it as the year 17,000, that 17,000 will immediately go to the top or the bottom of the list. So as I say, understanding those sort of functions can be really, really, really helpful. One thing I would say, and it's just one bit of caution, is I would say please be very wary of mass find and replace functions, especially working on several hundreds or thousands of records. I wouldn't rule it out completely. Being able to update hundreds or even thousands of records at the one time can definitely be very convenient, and it can be a massive advantage. But what I would say is that as the scale of the convenience increases, so does the scale of the risk. I've seen examples where someone's tried to maybe update as many as 30,000 records in a database at once, and they've made a mistake which they've then copied across thousands of records, and that's caused real problems. So that's something that you should always be wary of. I remember someone who worked with databases once telling me that if he ever notices a mistake that affects less than 50 records, he'll actually do it by hand because it's not worth the risk. What I would say is that if you ever are trying to update massive records at once, I would always practice in a small batch first, and just sort of do a practice run before you do larger ones. But as I say, the larger the collection, the larger the scale, the larger the complexity, and the larger the risk also. That's just something to be aware of. Okay, and one last piece of advice I would give is try know what the common mistakes are, and essentially this comes with more experience. Essentially, the more experience you get, you'll begin to notice what sort of errors come up in catalogue collections the most, and you'll also begin to learn more about yourself and what sort of errors you might make. So for example, one general thing I've seen in a lot of catalogues is that people can often get confused about different catalogue levels. So for example, I've seen people get confused about working between, say, file level or subseries level or item level, and they've maybe recorded information at the wrong level. And I think once you begin to sort of notice these patterns, and once you begin to sort of become aware of these common mistakes, I think it can be very powerful, and it means that you can have a sort of mini checklist of things that you can search for and to look at the end of a cataloging project when you're considering where the most common errors may actually be. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to give you a very quick case study. So a few years ago, I worked on a project where I was updating hundreds of archival catalogues in XML AAD. Many of these catalogues were very old and required a lot of work. Generally, this project went quite well, and there was a few reasons why I think this project went well. For a start, I benefited from having a very clear workflow and examples to follow, and I also made a point of planning time to review my work. That time I planned turned out to be really useful. I also used technology where possible. So for this project, I was using a software called Oxygen for processing XML files, and that offered features where you could mass check records and check for sort of certain errors, and it was really helpful. And also, as I became more aware of the project and I began working in more catalogues, I began to notice common errors. So I began to notice, for example, that some of the older collections, it tended to be the case that many of them didn't express dates, for example, or that they didn't have consistent extents. So as you began to work on certain collections, maybe certain collections that had been catalogued at a certain time or by a certain person from a very long time ago, you would begin to notice patterns and errors. And having this knowledge really helps you prepare, and it gave you an idea of the sort of, it allowed me to create a checklist of things to look at the end of a project when it was quality controlling. This project generally went really well. Maybe one thing I would say is that I maybe could have used the technology better, especially in mass updating records. But as mentioned, that increases the risk. For some of the catalogues, I think we were talking about 3,000 or 4,000 descriptions. And if you implement a sort of mass find and replace function with one of those catalogues and you make a mistake, it can duplicate right across. So that was something that I was always aware of. But generally, I think if you take enough precautions, I think that that's definitely something you can do. So anyway, that concludes the video. I hope you found it useful, and if you have any comments or suggestions, please more than free to post them below. Thanks again. And if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could like, subscribe and share. And also just to remind you that I would be absolutely delighted to take any requests for future videos also.